Hello everybody, my name is Marko Jurisic and I will talk about my project which I did for another company before I started working for Willhaben. So everything I say here doesn't have anything to do with Willhaben as a company. I will warn you in advance, it's slightly opinionated. Don't throw sticks at me. So at first a few words about me. I started programming some 20 years ago. Changed technology stacks every few years or few months, did some Java, servlets, applets, midlets, everything possible, then switched to frontend, did some PHP, then JavaScript, then again Java, then in the past few years Angular, and now React. So that makes me kind of a dinosaur in this field. First of all, I would like also some feedback from you. How many of you have done something with Angular? So, okay, about half of you. Only to know how deep do I have to go to explain some Angular fundamentals, etc. So, my motivation for this talk is, as already said, I worked on a big enterprise project which was successfully completed from my side, and as a kind of celebration I decided to wrap up all the lessons learned and share them with the community. Problem background, it was an enterprise application used in a very big transport company with some 200 screens with very complex forms, complex validations, complex data tables, etc. It was written originally in Python, I think, then later they switched to Node backend with Mongo database and with jQuery based frontend. It was very complicated and very difficult to develop, to add new features to it and to debug, and so the decision was made to rewrite the whole thing. At the time there was no Vue, so we had to decide between Angular and React. How we make this decision? We wrote one page, I think it was two pages actually, so one data table and one form in both of these frameworks, and then discussed how we should do further. And at the end we decided to go with Angular because the whole company, all other teams were doing Angular, and also mixing HTML and JavaScript was somehow to all of us developers. So we decided to go with Angular. We decided that we would do the transition, we would do a smooth transition, so no big bang deployment, but we started both applications, Angular and the old one, on the same Node server, and then switched one page after the other with parallel tests. And one advantage was that we had a running system at all times, sometimes with a few pages which did the same job in old and the new system, but disadvantage was that we had to stay backwards compatible at all times. A few times we forgot this and then had some problems, but that's another story. So decision was made and it began. I'm the one on the left, if you don't recognize me. We started writing our application in Angular. At the time when we started, it was early beta of Angular, and most of the tutorials looked something like this. So you had just some basics and had to build upon it. And many of those tutorials were also aged because there was a new beta version of Angular released every few months or weeks. So it was a really rapid development. And even today, official docs and examples look something like this for form support. So we have two fields and one select box. And just example of what we had to build was something like this, so you don't see it that much. But we have nested forms with repeaters with tabs which are nested in tabs. And if I change something on this form, then something in seventh tab should get read and die and disallow saving. So it was a lot of fun. Quick intro to Angular forms. So Angular has two types of forms. The first one is template-driven form, where all form logic is defined in the template, and it looks something like this. So we have this ng model, which does automatically binding between model and template, and if a new value comes, let's say from server, then the value of this text box will be automatically updated, and also if we type something in the text box, it will be automatically updated in the model. So all the examples at that time were made in this way, so we started that way too. And later we added validation, and for complex validation, it is recommended to use reactive forms, which are defined in code, in TypeScript. And there you have to define all your forms, etc. And for complex validation, it is much easier to do it in this way. But we didn't remove this ng model. We should have, but we didn't because everything worked and never changed the running system. So we just added a bit of functionality on top of it. And as a result, sometimes our form would get out of the sync with the model. And one symptom was this beautiful expression has changed after it was checked error, which occurs only in development mode. So you can just make it silent in production. And it occurs in development mode because Angular does 2 change cycles in development. And if something changes between these 2 change detection cycles, then you get this wonderful message. There were also many tutorials how to deal with this. And one of them is just to use change detector ref. And there are 2 ways how we can use it. We have change detector ref mark for check, which checks the current component and all the components up the tree, and also detect changes, which detects changes in component and in the components and the children components of this component. And so how would we do it? We just pasted one. If it didn't work, then we would do the other. If that didn't work, we would do both of them. Maybe it was the other way around. When that didn't work, then we would just sprinkle change detector all over the code and hope that it would work. Sometimes we even succeeded, but it wasn't a real solution. So a real solution was to rewrite all the forms to use only the reactive approach, so just one of those. And also we introduced using chain detection strategy on push wherever we could, so that gave us also some performance improvements. It was a few days effort, but now we have a clean solution and these ugly errors are not popping out anymore. Yes. So once again, a mixing of template-driven forms and reactive forms is a bad idea. It was deprecated in version 6, and in the version 7 it was removed, so actually we had to do it with the last update. Another common error, it's all JavaScript. Okay, we had TypeScript in the front end, but it's still JavaScript. So it's often said that it's one big advantage of modern web stacks. So we have JavaScript in the browser, JavaScript in the backend, and JavaScript in the database. What could possibly go wrong? What we did wrong there was that we had no validation, so we used native Mongo driver and just stored our objects in the database, and it worked perfect, no errors. But some helper user interface fields also landed in the database, which shouldn't have been there, and broke some third system down the pipeline. So we exported our data, and then nobody complained, everything was okay. And after a few weeks, somebody said, oh, hey, my system is not working, and you broke it. So the solution was to use Mongoose, and Mongoose enables us to write schemas for our data so that we can validate if the right data is flowing into the database, and also define data types, which fields are required. And there is also a magic word, ignore unknown fields, which prevented unknown fields from landing in the database. And this photo has nothing to do with Mongoose, but with Mongoose project, but I really like how the little guy is fighting the lion. So it's an example of Mongoose. So as already said, we started with a very early version of Angular, and planned to go on with regular upgrades. Each time when there was a major version, we would reserve a day or two and do the upgrades. And most of the time it was simple. We just update the package.json, do npm install and ng start, and we would get something like this sometimes. Actually, it was the biggest problem, the AOT compiler. Maybe a few words about AOT compiler. So Angular has two types of compiler which you can use. There's just-in-time compiler, which compiles templates and logic as you load them. And there is also a ahead-of-time compiler, which compiles all HTML code, CSS, etc., compiles them to JavaScript, and does bundle minification, obfuscation, etc., and then you get performance improvements. But as a side effect, you had to update your code a bit. So it was also not documented that all the fields which are used in the templates have to be public. As we started as Java developers, we made all the fields private, as they should be, and then we had to rewrite half of our application to conform with the AOT compiler. But it was a smaller change. One bigger problem, which also wasn't documented, is that we used HTTP to bootstrap our application. So we first did, before we booted Angular, we made a backend call to ask with which backend services are we speaking, on which stage am I running, etc. And it worked fine in just-in-time compiler, but ahead-of-time compiler wanted to explicitly add HTTP as a dependency. And we also had this nice warning from the web storm, but it worked. I think there are some 200 comments on GitHub issue which deals with this problem. And they are still popping out, so somebody is encountering this problem even today. For grids, we went with AG Grid. I must say it's the best grid solution on the market. They also had their quirks, so they did a lot of model changes in the past few years. We used the enterprise grid, so we paid for the license and did in-memory grid model with on-client paging, sorting, filtering, etc. So we used almost all of their features. And so they did some renaming of packages too. AG Grid core is now called AG Grid Community. I don't know why they did that, but I still had to change my code and alter all the imports. And there was also one very funny change. From one version to the other, they changed the sorting arrow direction, which started a nice discussion. So none of us developers noticed it. None of the users noticed it. The first one was our tester. They see everything. And he said, so I'm sorting ascending, and this arrow is pointing downwards. And then it started an interesting discussion. What is actually right? If I had sorting ascending, I expect the arrow to go upwards, but then my data goes from A to Z downwards. And so what is right? We also found some articles which are dealing with this theme, and it's not conclusive. Still, it was a funny problem. So this is an example of an old grid. It looked something like this, and it was almost impossible to change because half of the things were hard-coded, and those things that were not hard-coded were, I think this column was defined in some 15 files or something like that. So to add something was not trivial, and in the new version we introduced AG Grid, and there it's very easily to change the column types, and also users can define their own grid layouts. I stored all the data in the local storage so that each user could store their filter settings, column settings, etc. And if they refresh the page, it would all be there. Here are some examples of forms. Near the end of our project, we also got support from a very good designer, and she helped us a great deal to make the entire project more usable and to look better. At the beginning, we used all these red colors as in the old. We tried to mirror that design, and red is frowned upon in web design, so we transferred to this generic gray and blue design. I always made the joke, I started doing blue applications. I did blue applications for 10 years and was finally happy. Now I could do a red application, but it got blue too. Here is another example of one complicated form which was broken down in smaller chunks. So we had this navigation on the top, navigation on the side, and navigation, third navigation there. So all the editing parts were very small and easy to conceive. A few words about performance. Legacy grid, which I just showed you, took some 30 seconds to load. And there were about 4,000 items, and they were very big, so with tree data inside. And in the last version, we managed to reduce it to less than 2 seconds. How we did it? The first version, so the original, loaded all the data, and there is also for each entity there were multiple time slices. So we could define this data is valid from first 6 months this year, and then after in the next 6 months there will be some other data. And so some of these products had some 10 time slices, and it was just like if we would load 10 objects. And what I did, I implemented a poor man's GraphQL, so I loaded only the data that was actually shown in the table, and just for the current time slice, and also implemented server-side caching. And also, of course, Angular gave us some free performance improvements out of the box with ahead-of-time compiling, and that's how we achieved these 1.8 seconds. So, a few more lessons learned. I will repeat again. Mixing of template-driven and reactive forms was a very bad idea. And if I would do something like this from the start again, I would probably go with Redux or immutables or something like that to prevent accidental changing of model, because we had some problems there too, and which resulted in these expression has changed, etc. And also a good thing was to use this ahead-of-time compiler, which brought us great performance improvements out of the box. What I would like to see in the framework itself is a possibility to create lightweight components, maybe something like styled components in React, because in Angular we still have to create a class for each component and register it in a module, etc. So one-liner components would be a great improvement and would make our lives easier. And also the currently compiled code is very ugly, so you cannot debug it and look how it works. And I can't wait to see how it works with Ivy. So Ivy should make much better compiled code. I'd like to share also my favorite quote with you. An expert is a man who has made all the mistakes which can be made in a very narrow field. And also for the not dinosaurs among you, something similar by Taylor Swift: believe in everything you do, believe in your mistakes, and grow from them. A few closing thoughts. Finally, I would like to say that it was a really fun ride, so to grow and learn with the framework, and to implement each feature as it was introduced. So we introduced animations, ahead-of-time compiler, and many other features. Community is great, so nowadays there are also many good tutorials, such as Angular in Depth or the Totem series, or a blog of Matej Taja. And I must say, those were fun 3 years. And we also had this one printed on the wall of our office, and each time when we were at this point, we would laugh and know that it will get better. So I must conclude it's the best framework ever. I told you it will be slightly opinionated. Thank you. Yeah.